That seems unlikely. You're really counting on that fume hood being the thing.
You are praying to God Almighty that fume hood is doing its job.
Okay. Oh, mixed methods. What's that?
We only have 2 lectures left, like 2 slideshows.
So my goal is to be done by next Wednesday, so that the last class would be the 2nd.
Oh, so literally next week.
Yes, and then I will go hang out in my office, and it will be extra help. So you can come by for extra help on your major labs or exam questions or anything like that during that time. But yeah, we are rapidly running out of content, and I could make more, but I don't want to. And you don't want me. You really don't want me to either. So yeah, we should. Like, we're basically like pretty much done most of the material. We got 2 units left. We'll see if we can stretch it out till the end of next week. But we also, weirdly, we have 2 extra days of class this term because of where Easter falls, right? Because usually Easter falls during the term and it cuts out a Friday and a Monday. So, we ended up with 2 extra lectures worth of time for most classes. This one, just 1. So I would usually cut 1 lecture at the end of the term. And this year I'm going to cut 2. And no one has ever complained about this in the history of ever. And that last week is it's a garbage time anyway. Okay. We finished content. Yes, we finished content analysis. We don't want to go back to content analysis, do we? No. I'm going to open the blinds just a little bit and let in some sun, because I feel like a vampire. Alrighty, so let's talk about mixed methods. Okay. Is my microphone on? It is not. Hello. It's God talking. All right. So, fetch me 2 of every animal.
That's not that many anymore.
2 animals. No, 2 of every animal. Okay. So, sorry, Simpsons joke. All right. So we're talking mixed methods. So, since the beginning of the course, right, we kind of broke the course down into our quantitative and our qualitative. And it's like, okay, these 2 can't touch, icky, sticky, no touchy. One is bad, one is good, depending on which position you're from. So we're gonna kind of undo that a little bit, or undermine the clarity of that division, because I think at the end of the day, I think most people accept that both of these kind of types of research have something to add, and when used together, they're really useful. Now, I will give a nod to a sort of debate. There is a bit of contention around this term, mixed methods. Why? Because are you really mixing the methods, right? I had this debate with a friend of mine who's very uppity on terminology. And her point was, most people don't actually do mixed methods because you still basically keep the methodologies essentially separate. What you're actually doing most of the time is multiple methods, right? You're doing research with multiple methods. And you do them, I'll use a different color. I won't rewrite that. Orange, multiple methods. But you don't actually take, your quantitative and qualitative and mix them. You just use both of them in a kind of rich study to do, different kinds of research and find the places that each of them has limitations and fill those in. Now, I said to her, I'm like, well, yeah, okay, I accept that you're right. But the thing that you're talking about, everyone calls mixed methods. So I'm not going to reintroduce or, reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to call it mixed methods. But really, a lot of times when we're talking about mixed methods, we're really just talking about multiple methods, right? You're using different methodologies in different parts of a study to sort of get results. Okay, so, yeah. So, fully undermining the division that we've made through the entire course, but the division served its purpose, right? To focus on one kind or the other and give you a sense of them without, explaining where they always touch and can be used together. Both of them, right, are required to gain some kind of knowledge of the social world, right? And they tell us different things, right? And using these different perspectives, right, you can get really good studies that tell you a lot, right? You can get studies that help you figure out the what and the why. So, I mean, I'm honestly like, just the biggest fan of these multiple method studies. And I think they're, the best studies I've ever read are those that are done, with the kind of use of a bunch of different methodologies. Okay. Certain this is where I've taken too much out of the textbook. Certain epistemological and ontological positions may be associated with particular methods. We know this because we talked about it at the beginning of the class, right? Natural science epistemology, right? That positivist epistemology is often used in quant, and the interpretivist one is often used in qualitative things like ethnography and the like. Okay, I think it's time for me to switch to non-caffeinated beverage. At the beginning of my last class, I took a sip from this, and it's coffee, and I thought it was this, and I was like, "Whoa, that tea tastes terrible." It wasn't tea. Okay, I did that once with root beer. I thought I was drinking iced tea, and it was root beer in the cup, and it was a very unpleasant surprise. It's like, this iced tea tastes terrible. Okay, so multi-strategy research, what are we talking about? Basically, it's work that integrates quantitative and qualitative approaches. Sometimes we talk about mixed method, but multi-strategy, multiple method, all of these terms are somewhat interchangeable. Okay. And here's where, I feel like we get into a much more kind of real world way of thinking about research, right? At the beginning of the course, we outline ontology, epistemology, and all the assumptions that go into both of these types of research. I think most people, outside of really strict methodologists, don't actually really think that way. And if you're like, well, then why did you teach us that? Well, it's important to know. I think most people, will adopt methods for entirely sort of instrumental purposes, whether or not you're being philosophically or ontologically or epistemologically sort of consistent in your use of methodologies, right? I think when it comes down to it, most people are much more flexible than that, and they see the utility in these different research methods. Okay, so multi-method research will often be like, yeah, I don't care about these ontological or epistemological questions. What I really care about is what kind of cool results am I going to get? And I think that's okay, right? So we see a lot of combining of quantitative and qualitative methods. Ooh, short video. What is the odds that my audio is going to work? We're going to find out. Seems like every time I plug into a different device, I have to reset the audio on my laptop.
This is Frances Chumney with a quick introduction to mixed methods research. Mixed methods is a research approach that attempts to answer a research question through the collection and analysis of both quantitative and qualitative data. Two important characteristics of a mixed method study are the research questions and design. While the research questions inform what we are trying to learn about a phenomenon, they also inform the design that is selected to carry out the study. Generally speaking, a mixed method study based on an explanatory or exploratory research question will use a sequential design, which means that either the quantitative or qualitative data will be collected first, and then the other data will be collected. Similarly, a convergent research question typically calls for a concurrent design in which the quantitative and qualitative data are collected at about the same time. There are three types of mixed methods research questions: explanatory, exploratory, and convergent. All three types of questions rely on both quantitative and qualitative data, but the three differ in the order in which data are collected. The three types of mixed methods research questions also differ in how the quantitative and qualitative data are used once they have been collected. When the research question is explanatory mixed methods, the quantitative data are collected first. The qualitative data are generally collected after the quantitative data and are meant to serve the purpose of providing explanations for the results of the quantitative data. With this type of research question, the qualitative and quantitative data are collected at different times, but they work together to answer the same research question. When the research question is exploratory mixed methods, the qualitative data are collected first. The qualitative data are analyzed and the results are used to inform the collection of the quantitative data. With this type of research question, the qualitative and quantitative data are collected at different times, but they work together to answer the same research question. When the research question is convergent mixed methods, the quantitative and qualitative data can be collected at about the same time and are then used together to triangulate the findings and answer the research question. One of the challenges researchers face is the extent to which they can or should be confident in the results of a study. One of the best ways to increase a researcher's confidence in their findings is to provide evidence of the validity of the results. Triangulation is the practice of doing just that, drawing the same conclusion from more than one data set. Triangulation can be done with as few as 2 data sets or with as many data sets as a researcher can collect. One reason triangulation is so powerful is that the differing data sets do not have to include the same data collected from different groups or the same data collected at different times. The data could be collected from different groups or at different points in time, but the data could also be collected using different data collection methods, different modes of data collection, or the data itself could differ across sets. The distinction between mixed methods research and multiple methods research is often mistakenly overlooked. This error is understandable, though, given the inconsistency with which research terminology is used across various fields. The two terms are not synonymous, however, and it is important for students to understand the difference between the two types of research. Simply put, the difference is in whether quantitative and qualitative methods are used together to answer a single research question or not. When data from quantitative and qualitative methods are used together to answer a single research question, a mixed methods approach is employed. In contrast, in a single study that includes both quantitative and qualitative approaches, but those approaches do not answer the same research question, the study should be referred to as multiple methods. An easy way to remember the difference is that in mixed methods research, the results of quantitative and qualitative data collection are mixed together to answer a research question. In a multiple method study, multiple methods, being quantitative and qualitative methods, are used to answer multiple research questions.
Okay.
This is Frances Chumney.
Should we
with a
listen to
quick
her again?
introduction to-
No. Okay. I'm kidding. I'm kidding, obviously. Okay. So, again, I'm now going to undermine some of these very clear distinctions we made at the beginning of the course, right? So we said quantitative research was the one that exhibited kind of, those characteristics of natural science. But there's a lot, excuse me, ouch. I injured my leg last night again, and I stepped on it funny just now, and my leg hurts. So empiricist overtones, right? So sometimes when we're talking about qualitative research, it might not be as interpretivist as sort of the course has laid it out so far, right? Sometimes there are these empiricist overtones, right? What you want is observations of the real world, right? Direct contact with reality, right? Procedures in which theories are grounded in data, and the meaning people give to their actions ascertained through senses, right? So think of like ethnography, right? One of the guiding things, like, yes, we're interested in people's, getting into these communities, getting into groups and figuring out what's going on inside them. But part of an ethnography, right, especially participant observations of various kinds, is also essentially to get direct experience of particular groups, right, of particular social circumstances yourself, right? You want to experience it. You want to come into direct contact with the people at the furry convention so that you understand the furries ever so slightly better, right? That's part of the motivation for going out and doing participant observation, right? To actually observe people in their real environment. And often, right, a specific problem focus, right, it's less, often even qualitative research, well, we have this kind of idea of grounded theory as its sort of core, right? You go get your data and you figure out your theory after. In practice, that's not always the way it goes, right? There's lots of times where you have a very specific problem focus that you want to get at. You already have a theory of what you're going to find, and you're really looking for experiences qualitatively that are going to back up that position, right? So you do have, hypothesis and theory testing. Analytic induction and grounded theory are both kind of theory testing, but sometimes, right, you might have the theory and then you go get the data and then you do the two-step of grounded theory or analytic induction. We'll talk about both of them in the next unit in detail. To try and really, but people don't come in like with that blank slate of like, I am going to go collect data on this study and then figure out what I think. Okay, so you also have, kind of realism or critical realism that are often employed in qualitative studies, right? This kind of middle ground between our constructivist and objectivist debates, with the assumption that there is a social world that is reproduced and transformed in daily life, and that it's produced by mechanisms that are real, but not always directly observable. And social scientists, need construct hypotheses about them to try and explain what's happening, right? So again, how do we explain this? Critical realism is like my favorite school of sociology. I don't get to explain it in SOC 100 because I'm always stuck doing the Marx, Weber, Durkheim dance, right? We're a functionalist now, and now we're conflict theory. It gets tiresome. And then symbolic interactionism, which I feel like sometimes can just be whatever it wants to be. It's like, is this symbolic interactionism? Everything is symbolic interactionism, if you look hard enough. Critical realism is sort of my most favored kind of sociological school, which is always why I keep meaning to put it into SOC 100, but it's never in any of the textbooks, so I feel like it would be confusing. But basically, it's a school of sociology that says there is a real social world and there are real mechanisms. We can't observe them directly, right? You can't just look at them and they're hard to measure. So you have to go talk to people, experience people, get those quantitative measures, and then kind of make hypotheses about how they work. The best critical realist in the whole world, my buddy Christian Smith at University of Notre Dame, which I will not talk to you about, but he does a lot of religion research, and it's fabulous. Okay. That said, too, right? Oh, maybe I need a different color. We're going to go with green. Green is the color now. Goodbye, orange. Okay, lots of quantitative research is also interested in meaning, right? So some of this distinction we've made that quant research is all about the what and qual research is all about the why. I just realized that green is not going to work over here at all. Terrible choice. It could be worse. Blue? Da, 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 da. Not good. What color will work? Bright yellow? Bright yellow is always happy. Okay, perfect. Thank you for the suggestion. My daughter believes me to be colorblind. I'm like, look at that green car. She's like, it's turquoise. I'm like, right, green. Turquoise is green, right? Okay, she's like, no, it is not. Okay, so survey research, right, sometimes talks about attitudes and meaning and why people do the way, asking people, to rate how they would do things, their valuation, their reasoning for doing things, right? We have all of these things in quantitative research as well. Quantitative researchers will say that you can measure attitudinal things using quantitative tools if you kind of build your quantitative research around things you already know, right? So here, right, you could measure attitudes if, say, you started with qualitative research, right, you started with, say, like a qualitative pilot study, got some sense of particular kind of questions and attitudes you wanted to write or you wanted to check on using a quantitative method. So you create qualitative research, right, to get some insight into people, and then use that research to create quantitative tools that then allow you to, ask people about attitudes and opinions and all of these sorts of things that are interpretations that are more properly kind of qualitative in nature. Qualitative researchers will say they access people's worldviews more directly. But generally speaking, right, both tools can do this if they're done kind of correctly. Okay. So, through the entire course, we have created this distinction, right? The qualitative-quantitative distinction. One that measures things like behavior versus meaning. What versus why. One that uses numbers, it's our quant. One that uses words. One that uses artificial circumstances versus natural. All of these things are, theories and concepts tested in research versus emerging from data. And all of these distinctions are essentially they're useful constructs for kind of putting quant and qual in boxes and explaining them, and the projector is about to turn off. Okay. For basically, there we go. I saved it. That would have taken 5 minutes to turn off and turn back on, because these projectors are worse than the one I bought on Amazon for $7. No, $67 rather. Sorry, that's Temu, and that projector would not have worked. All of these distinctions are, at the end of the day, kind of false, right? Because both quantitative and qualitative research can operate under both modes in certain circumstances. So some of what we talk about in terms of qual and quant, we're creating an unneeded artificiality. Okay, so behavior versus meaning, right? Lots of quantitative social science considers meaning to be important, right? And you can see this in some of the kind of research that's being done quantitatively, right? They're asking people about meanings that they ascribe, how they interpret things, what their understanding of things are, because they consider it important. Qualitative research is interested in the what as well, how behaviors form, what people are actually doing in measurable kind of ways. Quantitative and qualitative, I think increasingly this distinction doesn't make sense, because increasingly, what I would say is in kind of sociology anyway, you're going to have people that specialize in quantitative and people who specialize in qualitative, and that's tends to be kind of orientation, right? What you're good at, than one where you're like, okay, philosophically, I'm opposed to qualitative research because I think qual is mushy and it's subjective and all of that stuff. I think we don't see as much of that, right? I think both sides are interested in the what and the why. They just approach these questions from different ways, and they use different tools. They go about it in different ways, and a lot of that is sometimes am I a math person? Am I a person that got really frightened at SOC 210? You're terrified of it, so you're I must be a qualitative researcher. Some of these orientations, right, are more about kind of personal skills than they are philosophical. Okay. So, again, one of these distinctions that we built, right, was that I can barely see the yellow on my screen, but you can see it clearly, right? That qual is deductive and so quant is deductive, qual is inductive. I got that right? Right? And again, that this is from, basically you go theory to data. And here you go data to theory. But again, a lot of this is sort of false, right? A lot of quantitative research, especially survey research, is inductive, right? A lot of times people will sort of wander out with a survey put that survey out in the world, and then figure out what was in it. Or, and I think this is probably even more the case, people will go to existing data sets. And I see this a lot without a theory, right? I'm gonna tell you about one of my buddies who does not know me, but we're best friends. His name is Ryan Burge. He's a professor of political science, and I know political science is a dumb topic because there's nothing scientific about political science, but we forgive him anyway for being a political science. It's not his fault. I mean, he did do a PhD in it, so I guess it is, but we'll forgive him anyway. No, I'm kidding. I just like to rag on poli-sci. Everybody makes fun of sociology, so I have to occasionally make fun of other disciplines too, just to make myself feel better. Engineers can barely spell their own names, but they can do crazy math equations, so there's that. Okay, so Burge. One of the things that Burge does, which I always find really interesting, he's a religion researcher, right? He's really interested in questions of religion, and he just goes to existing data sets. He doesn't really do any of his own surveys. He just goes to things like Monitoring the Future, General Social Survey, Comparative Election Study, and grabs their data on religion and just starts playing around with it, right? And he's like, oh, what am I going to find when I look at, what's the, is there a kind of link between education and religiosity, right? Is there a link between, education, how many children you have, and how religious you are, right? And it's just like a very inductive process because basically he comes up with a question, he sort of goes, grabs the data, tests it, creates a theory out of that, and then often will go and grab another data set, right? Then, I found this in the comparative election study. Well, does it hold up in the general social survey? And you test it, right? And he does this kind of almost grounded theory approach using entirely quantitative data, right? Give him a follow on Twitter. Or his fabulous Substack, Graphs About Religion. If you're like a sociology of religion super nerd like me, this is the greatest Substack ever written. And if you come take SOC of religion with me, you will find a million of his charts. And I always leave his name on it, but I'm stealing them openly. I'm sorry, Ryan. I guess we can't be best friends after all, even though we are. I've never met him, but we are best friends. We're best buddies. He just doesn't know it yet. Like any good stalker, we're going to be best friends. Okay. So these are some numbers. Doesn't happen just in quantitative methods, right? Lots of qualitative researchers use limited amounts of quantification in their research as well, right? And sometimes like quasi-quantification kind of, or semi-quantifiable things are used to make rhetorical points, right? It's like 80% of my interviewees said something like, right? So there's quantification that happens even in qualitative research, right? And lots of quantitative researchers gather and analyze data to better understand their subject to generate ideas, right? So they do kind of an inductive process, right? It's like, I don't know anything about topic X. So what do? I'm just going to go out and gather data and then come up, analyze it, look at it, play around with it, come up with a theory afterwards, right? So there's lots of this in both cases. How fast am I burning through this? Is this going to last 2 days? Oh well, c'est la vie. Okay, we'll talk about some of the specifics because I think the specifics are a little bit more interesting than these sorts of general things because I think they're kind of useful in different ways. Okay, so qualitative research often presents itself as naturalistic, claiming it studies people in their natural settings. However, things like interviews, right, actually are incredibly artificial, right? So even this definition of like, oh, quantitative research is so artificial because, you're having people sit down and answer a survey. That's not a natural social environment. It's like, shut up, qualitative researcher. You do the same thing by bringing people into an interview room, right? Is that a natural setting? Do people just like wander into interview rooms naturally and start talking to random people? No. So some of this distinction is also false. And participant observation, we've talked about how it introduces artificiality and reactivity. So it's not just an issue in quantitative research, right? It's less of an issue in qualitative research because you're trying to be more naturalistic. You're definitely more naturalistic than, say, a lab study. Doesn't mean that it's perfect, right? Okay. So here's what you might do. So if we go back, to what that video was talking about, qualitative research, you can use it to examine. Qualitative research can be used to examine quantitative methods, right? So you can check. So, for example, meta-ethnography, Hudson, can compare findings from different settings and contexts not otherwise accessible to a single researcher. Reliability measures for coding. Okay, that sounds really boring. So, you can use qualitative methods, you can use quant methods to analyze qualitative research, right? Okay, so in this kind of example, right, quantitative research, you would look at a whole bunch of different studies. Like meta-studies, right, are basically studies where you take a whole bunch of different studies and sort of analyze all of them for the findings that they came up with, right? This is really common in some fields, medicine especially, but you see this, even in I was looking at one a few weeks ago. It was like a meta-study of different research on porn, right? And on the social effects of porn. Because I teach a class on youth and I cover some weird topics. Okay, so what did they do? Basically, they were using kind of a quantitative method, right? So they were looking at instances of different words, different phrases. How many of the studies mentioned X? So how many of the studies mentioned, violence, right? How many of the studies mentioned body image, right? And they kind of took, this kind of meta-analysis, used quantitative methods to be like, okay, 80% of the studies looked at this, 90% of the studies looked at this. This is the kind of thing that you can use quantitative research to look at qualitative research, right? What do you find within those qualitative research studies? So you can use one to analyze the other. Okay. Now, quantification in qualitative research can appear in a bunch of ways, right? So sometimes you use quantification. So thematic analysis, an implicit quantification. Okay, what does this mean? It's written in researcher-ese. We must decode. Okay, implicit quantification may determine identification and prominence of certain themes. So if you're looking at kind of qualitative research, sometimes certain themes are mentioned a lot, right? So their prominence in studies, how frequently they are used, especially if you're doing kind of a meta study, you can use it to talk about, oh, my mic just went out. You use it to talk about how often things happen, right? How often themes are used, how often themes are repeated in interviews, in participant observation between various studies. You can use all of those things. Okay, quasi-quantification. So sometimes people use, many, often, rarely, many of my participants said, many of the interviewees said, a majority of people often said, these are all quasi-quantification terms. And then sometimes people use quantification in qualitative research to combat anecdotalism, right? So give them an actual number, right? Out of my 25 interviews, 22 people said, I don't know, whatever you want to imagine, right? Furries are weird. No, I don't know. That's me being weird. Me being mean to furries. The furries have cursed me and I can no longer speak. Short poverty. Okay, so, right, you can battle anecdotalism, right? Like, let's say you're writing up your qualitative research, and you quote John, and he was saying, that all of the furries he met are, odd people that he doesn't like. And it's like, 22 out of the 25 interviews that I did with friends and family of furries thought it was a little bit odd, right? So you find that. Okay, so some people still don't like multi-strategy or multi-methods, mixed methods research for a bunch of reasons, right? One of these is the embedded methods argument, right? That within, the use of a particular research method basically entails certain epistemological and ontological positions, right? So participant observation, you're taking an interpretivist position, and it's at odds with a natural science kind of model. So you shouldn't do it, right? You're going against the natural kind of philosophical inclinations of the tool itself. There is reason to question the embedded methods argument, right? It's a little bit hard to sustain, right? When we talk about, an embedded methods argument, it sort of locks you into a very small box, right? You can only use methods if you happen to agree with the epistemological and ontological assumptions of that method, which means, people get into these very narrow little boxes. It kind of cuts you off from a lot of social data that might otherwise be really, really useful. Okay. The paradigm. Recently, I've noticed for no apparent reason, the AI voice that I use to read things to me mispronounces things like paradigm, and it always pronounces it as paradigm. And I don't know why, because there's no American or British pronunciation that has ever said paradigm. But for whatever reason, the AI doesn't get that. Okay, so quantitative and qualitative approaches are based on these separate paradigms, right? And a paradigm is a worldview that are incommensurable. I like that word. That's a fun word. Incommensurable. So that's your kind of your paradigm argument, right? You can't use them because they view the world in totally different ways. They have a different worldview, and so you shouldn't be able to use them. But again, you can put yourself in little boxes if you like. Quantitative and qualitative research clearly aren't as separate as people tend to pretend they are. Okay, so I want to go into actual how you do this because that's way more fun. Okay, epistemological argument and a technical argument, right? So when we talk about an epistemological argument, quantitative and qualitative research are based on incompatible principles, right? So this is an epistemological argument against using mixed methods, and people who say this are saying these two orientations are incompatible, right? They don't make sense together, right? Because you can't do observations of the real social world using qualitative tools, right? That doesn't make sense because you're not observing things scientifically. You don't have the right, sampling. You don't have a big enough sample. You can't generalize, so it just doesn't work, right? So it's ontologically incompatible. Same thing with, if you're using a quantitative method, right? You can't really get depth into people's interpretations because you have different assumptions about the world altogether. That's our epistemological argument. Our technical argument, whoopsie doodles. Quant and qual methods, simply techniques that can be used without necessarily adopting their epistemological or ontological position. Now, I think this is the right position to take, right? Because I think both of them have their uses. They can reveal things about the world. Maybe that's why I put a light bulb on this one. I think you could also call this, an instrumental argument. And I like that term better than a technical argument. It's instrumental. So when you think about an instrumental or technical argument, basically you're thinking like the selection of a method is a decision about which window the researcher will open to look into a room, right? Now, that's a decent metaphor. I prefer a different one, which is the tool metaphor, right? So each of these, like quantitative, qualitative, interviews, surveys, whatever methods you choose, they're just tools in a toolbox, right? The toolbox is social science research, and that's what we're kind of getting at, right? We're trying to figure out interesting, fun, unique, compelling things about the social world, and what tool is going to get you there, right? So, if you want a general lay of the social landscape, you go with a survey, right? That makes sense. But if you want, I'm going to erase my things. If you want something more kind of in depth, right? So you get your landscape with your surveys, but you want to know more about why people are doing something, right? Then you get interviews, and they're just tools in the toolbox, right? They are just, no different than I have a bolt. I need a wrench to tighten a bolt, right? Well, I have a question about social landscape. I'm going to use a survey. I have a question about why the things I found in that survey are happening. I'm going to use interviews, right? So I think, this is, and I think this is where most honest to God social researchers today are. It's just like, we understand that all of this is just tools in a toolbox, and that we don't need, kind of ideological purity. Okay. Now there are some that do need ideological purity, but let's not talk about them. So we can talk about 3 ways that this actually works, right? So how do you do multi-strategy research? And I think this is the much more fun part of thinking about multi-methods or mixed methods or whatever. Okay. So triangulation. So we saw that in the video, right? And triangulation, right, this is a metaphor. It's based on kind of radio signals, right? Because triangulation, if you can get information, like if you were trying to track down where a radio signal is coming from, right? That's an antenna broadcasting. I'm sure it looks exactly like it. Basically, to get like an exact fix on where it's coming from, you basically need 3 points, right? So that you can be like, okay, the radio signal is taking this long to reach here, this long to reach here, this long to reach here, right? Then you can figure out where a radio signal is coming from. And that's, so like I said, it's a metaphor, and we use this in social science research basically to say, you can use quantitative research to corroborate qualitative findings and vice versa. So how would this work? Let's say you have I just noticed the tube of chapstick again on the ceiling. Every time I look up to think of an example, I look up and there's that tube of chapstick that's been there all term. I keep meaning to climb up on a table and knock it down. And then I realize that's not my job. Okay, so you find something in your, let's say your qualitative study, right? You discover that, I don't know, I don't want to be mean to furries. Is there another example I could use? No, it has to be furries, right? That furries broadly, in your qualitative research, that furries broadly adopted their furry identity based on some kind of childhood trauma, right? So you find this in your interviews, right? Okay, lots of childhood traumas, but you're not sure, you did maybe 10, 15 interviews. You're not sure how broadly applicable that is to the whole kind of furrydom. I don't know if furrydom is the right word. I'm going to go with it. So what do? You get a survey, right? You do a survey of, 500 or 600 furries, asking them questions about this so that you can basically, so you've got your data point, and then you confirm it with a second data point, right? So like the video said, you can do triangulation with just a couple of data points, and you can do this in either direction, right? You could do either, a quantitative finding that you back up with qualitative research, right? So, people tell you that, in surveys, you ask why people left religion, right? Why they left their religion, and they say, oh, it was because of a negative experience. And you go and you do qualitative research and ask people to tell you about why they left, their particular religious community, and you get that thing backed up, right? That's triangulation. Now you can, of course, have other things, right? You could do, like if you wanted to, you could have as many points sort of triangulating as you wanted. So you could have your interviews as your first point, your surveys as your second. You can go do some participant observation as your third, right? You could add it. I'm going to end up You could add in, I don't know, what's another thing that we could add in? Content analysis, right? So you add some content analysis, and then you add, I'm trying to think of another method, and I'm blanking. Whatever you want, right? You add a couple more methods at the end of the day, right? And you get your kind of triangulation of different things, right? You get all these things going on at the same time, right? And all of it is meant to kind of back up the initial point, right? The initial thing that you found, that initial finding. You could bring in as many different methodologies. You could do 2 different sets of interviews, right? You could do 3 different surveys, all backing up, a sort of finding. That's triangulation, right? Backing one up with the other. Okay. Facilitation. Okay, so what are we talking about when we talk about facilitation? You use one research strategy to help you with a different one, right? Okay, so this I'd say in a lot of ways is sort of my preferred one. Not that my preferences actually matter in terms of the course. This is the way I've always done research, is this kind of approach, right? This facilitation type approach. And it kind of works in the following way. So yeah, your qualitative facilitates the quantitative, and quantitative facilitates the qualitative. Okay, so we kind of talked about this. I think we've talked about this at different points in the course. But what does this look like in practice, right? Without reading all of these little bullet points on the bottom. Let's say you wanted to do a survey, right? So you wanted to do a survey, but you don't know anything about the topic, right? You're having trouble kind of getting a sense of the lay of the land, right? Of what would be interesting to ask in your survey. So what you do is maybe you do a qualitative pilot study. Non-random sample, so you do a snowball sample of interviews let's say with furries. Well, we're going to say furries. We're just going to keep coming back to that well. I don't know why. So you don't know what's interesting about furries, right? And you want to do survey research about furries, but you just don't know what's interesting. So you do a pilot study, right? So you basically do a pilot study. Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm on the right slide. You do a pilot study. You ask a bunch of furries questions about furries. You try to figure out what's interesting about the furries at the end of the day. And then you use those, right? And this is aiding measurement. You use what you got as responses to design your questionnaire items, right? So it's like, okay, now I've got some information. I've got some general impressions. I've maybe got a hypothesis about what's going on with furries, having talked to a few of them. And you do then your survey following that. Okay, you can do it the other way as well. So yeah, you can do it the other way, right? You could start with a quantitative. So you want to know something. You could do a quantitative pilot, right? Or you do a survey first to get a lay of the land, right? To figure out what the general landscape is. This is what I did in the kind of last big research project I did, which was I did a survey first because we kind of we had a sense that we knew what was going on in terms of sort of like attitudes to Catholic institutions in Edmonton, but we didn't really know. So we did the quantitative portion first, and then we used that to build our qual portion, right? I used that to build my focus group question and figure out what questions I wanted to ask. So it wasn't even a pilot study in that case. It was actually just a survey, actually 2 surveys, pretty full featured surveys. I guess too much detail, not that interesting. I could tell you all about the design, but let's not go there. So we did these 2 surveys, right? And then we used that to get our questions for the focus groups, which allowed us to then ask really interesting questions about real phenomenon that we were seeing rather than asking just general questions, right? So an aid in measurement, right? Okay, so this last point. I'm going to be honest with you because this doesn't work for the most part. So, and I know this because I tried it and it doesn't work. So, providing participants, right? So your quantitative study can identify people who could participate in qualitative research. This doesn't work specifically unless, say, you have your own research center or your own research tool. But if you're using an external tool, right? So like when I did my polling through Abacus Data, the best data firm in the country. I am absolutely certain. I really love Abacus. They do great work, and they will run polls for you at very reasonable prices. They were both, I thought, the best and the cheapest that I found. Take that, Ecos. Okay, so now one thing. I knew I was doing a qualitative phase afterwards, so I wanted to throw in a question on the end of the survey. Could you enter your email address if you would like to participate? Now, for all sorts of ethics reasons, right? This actually is an ethical problem, right? And if you tried this, people have done this in the past, but it is a bit of an ethical problem because suddenly, if you have their contact information and you know halfway what you're doing in like SPSS or R or anything, you could easily tie that specific data back to the participant who entered it, right? Even if you say you're not going to, you could. So suddenly, if you're saying like, my survey is anonymous, then it's not, because you've now collected identifying data. So that can be a little bit of a problem. The big platforms, right? So I know Abacus wouldn't do it, Leger wouldn't do it. I tried it on SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey wouldn't let me do it either. I checked because at one point it looked like we might have to use SurveyMonkey for all sorts of reasons. They will not let you collect identifying data. So if you're doing, say, a quantitative portion, that can actually be really hard. When the U of A used to have its own quantitative research center, the Population Research Lab, it was more possible to do because they would have actually done it for you. But today it's basically impossible. No one will collect this data for you. So if you end up coming to this, right, don't plan on getting your research participants from your quantitative data, because by and large it doesn't work, right? There's just ethical problems and there's practical problems that most of the platforms will not let you collect that personalized data if you've said you're not collecting personalized data. And that's usually one of the promises, right? When you're doing a survey is, it's anonymized, so we won't know who you are. So there's that. Okay. So, complementarity. Always with a British accent. I don't know why. Sounds like a very British word. Okay, so using two or more methods or approaches where a single approach would not be sufficient, right? Filling in the gaps, right? So again, this is a lot of like quant-qual, quantitative, qualitative research. Each of them has sort of gaps in obvious ways. And so you use them to kind of fill in the gaps, right? You got the what, you want the why. That's, your complementarity. So, you want to figure out the static and process features of a social situation, right? How things are changing or what the kind of like lay of the land is. Those are different things. Different levels of data, right? Level, kind of big social data and more meaningless level data. That's one. And yeah, you can use it to test the generality of findings encountered in qualitative research by using quantitative data gathered from random samples, right? So, you think that you see something, that might be generalizable in your qualitative data, but obviously qualitative data doesn't lend itself well to generalizability, right? So you do quantitative research to fill in that gap, and you get a big enough sample that you can then generalize those findings. And you can say, I found this, we wanted to test its generalizability, and you go and you do quantitative data, right? Whatever it happens to be, right? You run a survey on your furry population to see how many of them experienced childhood trauma that led them to the furry fandom. Okay. Hey, my voice is about to give out on me. Okay, qualitative data. You can use it to interpret the relationship between variables found in your quantitative research. This is also really common, right? You have data, you don't know how they're connected, but you have certain trends in your quantitative data, and you go and you talk to people, right? You do interviews, and you ask people themselves how they interpret these things, right? And then maybe they tell you the reason that my shoe is untied again. No, that you don't tell them the reason my shoe is untied again. They tell you the reason that they're seeing these two things being connected, right? They connect them for you in your qualitative data. Okay. And yeah, different methods, you can use them to look at different aspects of a phenomenon, right? Your two methods can be used to answer two different sets of questions, right? So yeah, you can have separate research questions. You can have a research question 1 and a question 2 and use different methods to answer different parts of those questions, right? Because you might be interested in different aspects of a same phenomenon, one from a quantitative side, one from a qualitative side. And again, kind of like that video suggested, that's true multi-methods research, but the terms are used interchangeably often. This is a slide that I clearly put here so I could draw something in a past semester. So I'm going to draw a big smiley face because we are almost done the course content. That's distressing. Maybe I'll give him some irises. There we go. Better. Not good, but better. Art is my passion. No, kidding. Okay. Oh, yellow is not going to work here at all. No, it actually works well. Huh. Well, who knew? Okay. Oh, I think I just covered all of this a second ago. Oh, actually, there's one thing that I really need to talk about in our filling in the gaps. Okay, when a researcher can't rely on our quant method or our qual method alone, a multi-strategy approach can be used to fill in the gaps. And this is the important thing, and I'm going to say this. This is the important thing for your major lab and the thing that you absolutely must do if you want all of the points for the major lab section where you have to pick, how you would potentially integrate a mixed method approach, right? So here, I'm going to give you the tip. It's what order are you doing it in? So, that's the priority decision. Will your principal data gathering tool be quantitative or qualitative? Right? So which one is your main tool, right? Now, probably for your major lab 2, you're going to want to put it as the qualitative, right? Because we are talking qualitative research in that one. But it is is there one of these that is your major and most important tool out of the 2? Okay? So the priority decision, which one's more important? You can also say they're equally important if you need. Yeah?
Stating that one of your methods is your primary set of data, and that it's and it's not explicitly saying this is where I'm going first, but saying this is primary data and this influences how the quantitative survey will be the outcome of is that sufficient enough?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, totally. Okay. The other one, and this is the more important one, the sequence. In what order are you going to do these things? Right? So, when you're talking about sequence, there's no wrong way of doing this, right? You just have to say which order you're going to do it in. So when we're talking about sequence, right, you just have to decide which one, in a sense, which one is in service of the other and how you're going to do it, right? So you can do it as a preliminary thing, right? So you can do, let's say, you're really interested in the qualitative question, but you need to get your lay of the land, right? So you start with your quant survey to develop kind of your interview guide, right? You're going to use it to develop your interview guide and give you a lay of the land, right? So you start with quant, you do a survey. It's still not your primary tool because what you're really interested in is those in-depth interviews, but you do that one first, right? So that is a potential, a potential way. You can also do, qual pilot study. You do your qual pilot, right, to develop themes and questions, and then you do, your survey. And again, that's where, the qual part, is like your interviews or focus groups or whatever are very junior to the whole thing. You can do it much more evenly, right? Where the qual, you're doing interviews, and you take these interviews seriously, and then to test, what you found in the interviews, right? To test its generalizability, you go and you do quant and a survey. I'm running out of space to write. And if I write at the bottom of the slide, sometimes I try. Are you taking pictures of my doodles? Okay, that's fair. You want to? I can go back to my smiley. You can take a picture of him too. No, I'm kidding. Okay, what was my other one? I got qual, quant. Okay, you use the quant to figure out, and you figure out the what, right? And you develop a theory, and then you want to figure out the why, right? So then you do interviews, right? Here, I would say, your methods are a little bit more co-equal, but that sequencing decision here matters as well, because you're going to start with the quant, and the qual is really to interrogate the themes from the quant, right? Not just get a lay of the land, but actually to be like, okay, what did I find here, and what is the reason for it? Like, how are people interpreting it? So that sequencing decision, right, just make sure, spell it out really clearly on your major lab. Spell it out. Yeah. 75162. Sorry.
You don't actually have to have quant questions in the lab, right? That's only looking at qual system.
Yeah. So for the lab, you only have to tell me what you're going to do. You don't have to then go and create a survey to support your qualitative. I just want you to kind of think through, like, what would I do? How would I do it? Why would I do it? Right? And what order? How is it supporting? Is it a pilot study to kind of figure things out, figure out the lay of the land, which I do first, but you don't then have to like create your survey questions. We've done that. We've moved on. We're good. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So generality, right? Qualitative research sometimes presents research findings without evidence to indicate how typical they are. Quantitative comparisons can be used, right? That's pretty obvious, right? You go and you figure out how common a particular set of responses is using quantitative research, because, if you did, 30 interviews, you can't really say anything because your sample size is too small. But you can then go use quant to back up your findings, right? So again, you might, in my little messy on yellow hell here, right? You might start with, qual, you do your interviews, then you do quant, essentially to kind of figure out how general it is, generality, all that fun stuff. Okay, right, we might end even a class earlier than I thought, because I burned through mixed methods in record time. Okay, we are on our last slide, and we are 15 minutes early, and we're just gonna live with it. Okay, qualitative research. I actually took a lot of stuff out of this, because when I initially did it, there was a lot more stuff about epistemology and ontology, and I figured, you, as engaged as you all are with questions of epistemology and ontology, that at this part of the term, especially in the winter, everyone's kind of like half alive. So I took a lot of it out. So it's a lot shorter than it used to be. I should show you the videos initially. It goes on for hours. Okay, so qualitative research might help interpret the relationship between variables, right? So one strategy is looking for an intervening variable, right? Okay, that's an important point too. Sometimes, as you know, because as a triangle with an X in it. This is the automatic design that PowerPoint does, and I don't know why it chose triangle with X in it, but I do like it. If there's a spurious variable, sometimes qualitative research can help you figure out what the spurious variable is, right? And think about it, right? You've got a clear relationship between two variables in quantitative research, right? One is moving with the other, but you suspect that there might be something else going on, but you just, for the life of you, because you didn't measure it, you can't figure out what that spurious variable is, right? So, I mean, the classic spurious variable example, right, is the link between ice creams and murder, right? Ice cream sales go up, ice cream goes up, murders go up, right? And of course, we know that this is a funny thing. It's actually true. When ice cream sales increase, murders increase as well. And so you could draw the conclusion, and it's very reliable, that murders cause ice cream, or ice cream causes murder. Ice cream causes, when you write your paper, like the correlation between ice cream sales and murder, one of the ways that you could, and I swear, this is actually a real social science finding, and it's incredibly reliable. But of course, the spurious variable is heat. And so you go, and interview some people who committed murder during this particular heat wave, and you're like, so which flavor of ice cream was it that caused you to commit murder? And they're like, no, actually, it was just hot, and I was, grouchy, or I was outside because it was too hot, and that fool, whatever his name is, came up and I stabbed him, right? And you're like, oh, it's the heat, right? It's the heat. So you probably never would have figured that out from your existing social science data, or maybe you would have. But doing interviews can help with that, right? Because then you actually talk to people and you're like, oh, there's a third variable. And then you're like, when I bring in weather data to my ice cream versus murder scenario, I see that actually, it's the heat that causes both of those things. So off we go. I am done. 12 minutes early. That is mixed methods. We will come back on Wednesday and hopefully not finish up the course 2 weeks early. Cough, cough. I feel a flu coming on. I don't know. We'll see. But we're done with that. The next one is 27 slides long. We'll talk qualitative data analysis till the cows come home. I'm just going to embed like 27 YouTube videos into this to stretch it out for another week. Okay. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday. Wednesday. It's only Monday, Paula. I don't know why I am or who I am.